Hello, and welcome to the March 2024 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. Our guest this evening is John Drescher, contributing editor and writer to the Assembly here in North Carolina, and he will be in conversation with TAF member Ed Bristol. John, Ed, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Don. Well, folks, as you've heard tonight, we have the good fortune to be talking with a veteran journalist who's brought his reporting and editorial gifts to newspapers from Columbia, South Carolina's The State, to the Charlotte Observer, to the Raleigh News and Observer, where for his last 10 years there, he served as executive editor and the senior vice president. A more recent gig was at the paper that won the Pulitzer for its landmark Watergate coverage, the Washington Post, where he served as deputy editor of the paper's political investigations team. John's also the author of the book Triumph of Goodwill: How Terry Sanford Beat a Champion of Segregation and Reshaped the South. John is now back home and will talk about his most recent enterprise, writing and editing for The Assembly, a digital-first magazine that specializes in deeply reported journalism about power and place in North Carolina. John, first off, tell us about the Assembly, how it finds itself in kind of a special niche in the state's journalism universe. What's its origin story, and how difficult was it to get off the ground?
So the Assembly just had its third birthday, and it was started by Kyle Vilmain, a young speechwriter, formerly worked for Margaret Spellings and Carol Folt at UNC. And I was at the Post a little over 3 to 4 years ago, and Kyle had this idea for a digital magazine focused on power in North Carolina. And I was impressed. We had mutual friends and we had a couple of conversations. He had a good business plan. I'd seen a lot of, since the decline of daily newspapers, I'd seen a lot of proposals from journalists who had idea for a new publication. And sometimes they had a content vision, but rarely did they have a content vision and a business plan. And Kyle had a business plan for a subscription-based publication. And so when he actually launched in February of 2021, I was still at the Post. But I was a short timer at the Post. I left about a month later in late March, and had some time on my hands, and called Kyle. At the time, he was pretty much a one-man show, and said, I'd be glad to help you in any way I can, thinking that it might lead to 5 to 10 hours a week. But Kyle took me up on my offer, and pretty quickly it was substantially more than that. So for the first year, we relied all on freelancers. We were publishing one story a week usually. And Kyle and I were the editors, and we were both writing some also. And we've since added 5 reporters and 2 other full-time editors. I'm now full-time. Kate Shepard, who was at Huffington Post, is our managing editor. And then Emily Stevenson, who's from North Carolina, went to UNC, just started with us a couple of weeks ago. We hired her from the Wall Street Journal. So we now have a total of about 12 employees, including employees on the business side of the operation. So we're 3 years and going strong, not making money yet, but we've attracted enough investors that we have some runway. And so we're building subscriptions. That's our main source of revenue. We also have some advertising revenue from our email newsletters. So that's the short story of the Assembly and where it came from.
The magazine describes itself as deeply reported journalism about power and place in North Carolina. Can you flesh that out for us with a few examples? Power and place. What's that about?
Well, we write a lot about power, and that doesn't have to just be politics. I mean, we do a significant amount of politics reporting, but we'll also write about power in religion. Barry Yeoman did a terrific piece for us on the split up in the Methodist Church last year. So that was a good piece about power, but in a church setting. We've written about sports. We did we don't write, traditional kind of game story on the field sports coverage. Again, we're trying to get behind the scenes. Usually when we write about sports, it has to do with the financial side of sports. So we did a story that compared the leadership tenure of the Carolina Panthers owner with the leadership of Tom Dundon at the Carolina Hurricanes. So that was an example of a sports-oriented story that we did. And we write about the environment. We did significant coverage on the primary. We had an early primary this year in early March, but we publish about a story a week on the primary. The first story that we kicked off our coverage with this year was a piece on Mark Harris. He's the former Baptist minister who in 2020 appeared to have won a congressional seat. But then the State Board of Election determined that there was voter fraud and Harris stepped down. They called for a new election. Harris did not run again. But he made a comeback this year. And Tim Funk did a really fine and deep piece on Mark Harris's comeback. And indeed, Mark Harris's comeback is complete. He won the Republican primary and now faces almost certain election to the United States House of Representatives.
I hear some old hand names in there, Barry Yeoman and Tim Funk. That's a good collection of folks.
Yeah, let me run with that for a second. So, we started off as all freelance, and there's some terrific freelancers around, including the two guys who you just mentioned. And it's been really fun for me. Tim and Barry and I were all reporting colleagues in Raleigh,
Yeah.
covering state government and politics going back to the 80s. So, so for people who are familiar with North Carolina journalism, we've had some really terrific veterans write for us. Those two, some of my other former colleagues at the Charlotte Observer, Jim Morrill and Pam Kelly, have done fantastic stories for us.
Yeah.
At the News and Observer, former NNO people, Ann Blythe and Eric Frederick have written really good pieces for us. So, but we've also added full-time reporters. I know I'm talking with a group of freelancers, and I like the mix that we have between the freelancers and the full-timers. Freelancers, of course, often either have other story assignments or other jobs. And so we don't have full control of their schedule like we do with full-time reporters. So I really enthusiastically like our model, which is some of our stories coming from freelancers and some of them coming from reporters on our staff.
You talk about power and its several places in the universe here in North Carolina. What about place? What does that mean in the context of your magazine's concept?
We want to have a real North Carolina feel to it. And I hope that it does. I think that it does, but a couple of stories that come to mind. We had kind of an offbeat story recently about cheese biscuits, which are really an Eastern North Carolina thing. And I think the reporter enjoyed eating cheese biscuits at various places in Eastern North Carolina, including Abrams, my favorite, Abrams Barbecue in Pine Tops, North Carolina, which I think has the best cheese biscuits, although the author of the piece thought they were good, but that there was another place that had better cheese biscuits. We did a story about Vicky Bass Knight, who operates a seafood restaurant that her dad used to operate, Mark Bass Knight, on the Outer Banks. Yeah. And she is one of the few operators who, when she says serves locally catched seafood, it really is all locally catched. So those are some examples of some stories that I think provided a sense of place in North Carolina.
Is the assembly model a new genre of journalism? Is for example, are there other states who are putting this model to work that you're aware of?
So I hope the answer to your question is yes, it is a new model for journalism. So what's happened is with the decline of local papers, locals and regional papers, there have been a whole bunch of innovative efforts that have bubbled up. Most of those are nonprofits. And there's some really interesting nonprofit news operations in North Carolina. North Carolina Health News, operated by Rose Hoban, has a specialty in health news, covers state government and legislature as it relates to health policy. It's done a really nice job. Out west, the Asheville Watchdog is another nonprofit that has a number of retired Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists who have just continued to do, fantastic work. So there's a Border Belt independent website in southeastern North Carolina that's a couple of years old. It's also a nonprofit covering 4 counties in southeastern North Carolina, including Bladen and Robeson. So there's a lot of things like this bubbling up in Charlotte. Tony Messia, former Charlotte Observer colleague, has had a lot of success with Charlotte Ledger, which he started. So there's a lot of things bubbling up. Most, but not all of them are nonprofit. Now, we are not nonprofit. We have stockholders who've invested in us, which has provided us with some runway till the profitability that we expect to come down the road, probably in 2025 or 2026. So our model is a little bit different than most. I'm not aware of another similar publication to ours in another state. There are some longtime magazines, Texas Monthly, for example.
Yeah.
But in terms of being a digital startup magazine that focuses on not really on quantity, but on quality, I'm not really sure of anything very similar to us. I will tell you that we have had a significant amount of journalistic success in the last 3 years, and we've attracted a fair amount of attention. And I know of one national media company that's kind of watching us to see if what we're doing could be duplicated in other states. So I think we have a good chance at long range viability. And if that happens, I certainly see the possibility that others would try to duplicate what we've done.
Let me go to a sidebar for at the moment. We talked about the reporters who graduated or left and come over from print. What are your reflections on the health of newspapers in general and possibly in North Carolina themselves? I get rumors and hear things that some papers are trying some new things or reinventing themselves. What's going on?
Well, I'm rooting for them. I spent the vast majority of my career working for the News and Observer in Raleigh and the Charlotte Observer, and still have former colleagues at both of those papers, which are now owned by the same company, McClatchy, which went into bankruptcy a few years ago and is now owned by a hedge fund called Chatham Asset Management. And that's not Chatham as in Chatham, North Carolina. I think, being honest, any journalist would say you don't want to be owned by a hedge fund. They have a different purpose than public service journalism. So,
or Rupert Murdoch, for that matter.
Yeah, at least Murdoch is longtime media, and actually, just kind of as an aside, the people I know at the Wall Street Journal are actually fairly satisfied with the ownership that he's provided there.
Oh.
But I don't, the national papers, the Journal, the Times, the Post, that have national scale, have figured out a way to get a lot of digital subscribers and are doing okay. But the local and regional newspapers have been really hit hard. Their staffs have been cut 50, 60, 70, 80% in the case of McClatchy, and more in Greensboro and Winston-Salem, from what I hear. So I wish them the best. I think, I'm not sure what the reinvention will look like. I can imagine a journalistic reimagining. It's harder for me to see what the business model is that's going to allow them to bring in the revenue they need.
Yeah. Well, let me take you back a little bit. I understand you were the first writer hired by the magazine. Your first story was about the controversy over UNC Chapel Hill's hiring of African-American author and professor Nicole Hannah Jones. Tell us about what led you to the story, what were the forces at work, and how those events played out.
Yeah, a little background first. My first year, when Kyle and I were working that first year, neither one of us was drawing a salary. You know, we were so I wasn't actually well, I'm trying to think of what I guess Kyle and I were we the first people hired at the assembly. We basically worked for the first year without pay. So when I wrote that story, I wasn't actually getting paid.
Oh,
Uh, Although I had and still have an ownership stake in the operation. But I just got a tip that you know, that Walter Hussman, who the journalism school at UNC is named after,
right.
and has a significant journalism company in Arkansas, was actively lobbying behind the scenes for UNC to not hire Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is a UNC Chapel Hill grad in the grad program, and also a former colleague of mine at the News and Observer. So I knew Nicole and I knew Walter. Walter and I had served on a board at the journalism school together, and I disclosed all this at the bottom of the story. But I was able to obtain numerous emails that Walter Hussman had sent to various people at UNC, including the dean of the journalism school and the chief development officer. And those emails were pretty plainly worded that he thought would be a really bad idea for UNC to hire Nicole Hannah-Jones. And that was really our first story. That was summer of 2021, and we'd only been around for a couple months. And that was our first story that really broke big news and kind of put us on the map and got us a lot of attention because that story quickly went national. I remember we posted that story on a Sunday afternoon, and I just, I tweeted it and just watched my tweet just blow up like something I'd never seen before. But eventually, a lot of national media reported that. Most of them credited us, the Post, the Times, and others, NPR. So that's the backstory on that story.
Do you think your story had an effect on the outcome of that saga?
Well, so the outcome, just to remind people, was that eventually the UNC Chapel Hill Board of Trustees did vote in a split
Yeah,
vote to extend employment to Nicole Hannah-Jones,
right.
but she turned them down.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that my story factored into that decision that they made one way or the other.
Mhm.
I think the fact that Walter Hussman was actively opposing her kind of added fuel to what was already a pretty raging debate about whether to hire Nicole Hannah-Jones or not.
Yeah. To the Assembly website lists at least 14 articles that you've authored or co-authored. Tell this group of writers what might be your favorite one or one that posed a particular challenge in pulling it together.
Well, for
You got
me,
a choice.
yeah, for me, the story that meant the most to me was in right around September 1st of 2021 was the 30th anniversary of the Hamlet chicken plant fire that where 25 people died in Hamlet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for people who've been in North Carolina a long time, and especially for journalists, that tragedy is something we still remember. And it was a tragedy in a lot of ways, but what made it really tragic, it's completely, it didn't need to happen at all. If you remember, several doors were locked, and employees, there was in essence, a huge grease fire that broke out in that plant. And if the doors had not been locked, and if the plant had had a sprinkler system, it's highly likely that nobody would have died there. But I didn't want the anniversary to go unnoted, so I started off just kind of doing a basic anniversary story to kind of keep the memory of these people alive. And by the way, there are still some survivors of that fire who are still in daily pain. And one of them I interviewed for the story. And so it started off as just kind of a basic anniversary story, but I wanted to, in the process, I wanted to answer the question of what did it mean in terms of workplace safety in North Carolina? And
Yeah.
so I looked at the fatality rates over the years, and I looked at the number of inspectors. And in the 5 years after the fire, North Carolina dramatically increased the number of workplace safety inspectors. No workplace safety inspector had ever been in that plant in its 11 years of existence. North Carolina added a bunch of workplace safety inspectors, and it also dramatically increased the fines for violations. And what happened fairly quickly was that the number of workplace fatalities in North Carolina went down. But over the years, the fines went back to where they were, and the number of workplace safety inspectors has declined in, say, like the last 10 years. And during that period, the workplace fatalities in North Carolina started to rise again. So to me, it sure appears to be a pretty strong correlation between the number of workplace safety inspectors you have and the number of fatalities. So reverse correlation.
Hmm.
So that was one thing I wanted to report on. And then the other thing was that after the fire, there had never been a workplace safety inspector in that plant. But every day there was United States Department of Agriculture inspector. And after that, but the ag inspector just checked on the safety of the chicken, not of the people.
Huh.
However, the ag safety inspectors knew that the doors were locked. In fact, one of them even approved the locking of the doors. So
Oh,
after that happened, there was this outrage in Congress, and USDA reluctantly agreed to give basic safety training to their ag inspectors. But when I looked into it, I found out that even though they agreed to do that, they had actually never done it. They had actually never, the USDA had actually never trained all of its inspectors and gotten them to report obvious safety violations. So
wow.
when Congressman David Price, who I interviewed for the story, when he learned that USDA had never done what they said they would do in a written agreement that was on their website, he basically forced them to comply. So I get a certain amount of satisfaction in that the little old assembly in North Carolina, which at the time was maybe 6 months old, finally got the United States Department of Agriculture to do what it promised to do in writing in the early 1990s.
Wow. That's great. To shift gears a bit, we just might have a few folks here tonight that would be interested in writing for the assembly. I'm going to spare you the task and read the list of categories your website suggests the magazine might be interested in. And it's a considerable list: higher education, politics, business, culture, place, criminal justice, the courts, the environment, health, media, business, and essays. That's a pretty good list. And I'm wondering, what are the criteria that the editors there are looking for in freelance pitches in these areas, including things like word count, et cetera?
So, our specialty is long form reporting. So most of our stories are in the 2,500 to 3,500 word range, and we pay roughly $1 a word. It often ends up being a little bit less than that, and it kind of depends on the amount of reporting that goes into the piece. Um, so we do get pitches. We have a spot on our website that gives some more detail about what we're looking for in pitches. And we have an email address, and this is on the website, pitch@theassemblync.com. What I look for in pitches, first of all, they don't need to be long. I really don't like getting really long pitches. Excuse me. A paragraph or two is usually enough for me to tell kind of what the essence of the story is. But I'm looking for a story that you wouldn't read anywhere else in North Carolina. Our whole reason to exist is to do distinctive journalism. And if it's a story that feels to me like I could read it in one of the state's newspapers on a regular basis, then it's probably not something that we're going to be interested in.
Hmm.
It needs to be revelatory. And it almost surely needs to have some kind of tension in it. There needs to be some kind of somebody wrestling with something, or the state having some kind of policy conflict. Um, we want to publish stories that are really good reads, but at the same time, we really like to break news in the process. And I think you
Yeah.
can, when you can tell about the way I'm talking about the stories, that we want to reveal things. So we are about good writing, but we're just as much or more so about good reporting.
In addition to buying the article, what are the druthers on rights, the rights that the writer might retain, what you're buying, etc.
So I'm not the best person on that. I think that if we pay for the story, we have the rights to it, and I'm almost certain that that's our belief, that we want to own the rights to our stories. And we do co-publish stories with other publications. Um, we've done some really successful collaborations with a lot of people, Axios, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and others. But I think the answer to your question is that the rights stay with us.
Okay. I guess on the website, folks can learn who to send their pitches to and by what means, that sort of thing.
If you send it to pitch@theassemblync.com, it will go to one of the editors. We're not a big operation. We basically have 3 editors now. Kyle Villamain, who's the founding editor, spends most of his time on the business side of the operation. He really functions like a publisher now. And so Kate Shepard, managing editor, is the person who the pitches go to. And we have a meeting every Friday to go over the pitches that we receive from various people.
Okay. I'm just really curious and want to divert you a little bit back to your time at the Post. I'm wondering, that investigation unit that you helped run, was that in existence in 1973, or is that something that came out of the writings of a couple of obit writers who broke the Watergate story? What's the history there?
So the Post has several investigative teams, and there's a kind of traditional investigative team, which has been around for a long time and does amazing work on it. And Greg Whitlock, who's a Duke grad, is a member of that team. And Craig did some fantastic stories about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Actually, I guess his story was before that. It was about the kind of complete lack of financial controls and accountability on spending. Um, but I was part of a team that was more recently created, and it tended to be the team I just described. You have reporters who often spend 6 months to a year. And the team that investigative team I was on the national politics staff, and it was a team that tended to move faster than that, more closely tied to the news. And it's been a really successful team. It's my former Charlotte Observer, Carol Lenig, is now a reporter on that team. And Carol must have the record for Pulitzer Prizes. I think she's either won or shared 5, I believe.
Wow.
But some of those were from her, some, if not all of those, were her work on the team that I was a part of.
Yeah. I see her regularly on the air, on TV, as a regular commentator.
Yeah.
Well, anything you want to add to all of these thoughts that you've helped us understand?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I'm pretty excited about what we're doing at the Assembly. I'm enjoying the work, and I think there's a need for what we're doing in North Carolina. And I don't have any doubt that there's a journalistic need. And what we're trying to find out now, are we filling a market need too, whether people will pay for it?
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be yes. We continue to grow paid subscribers. And so I'm excited about what we're doing. The contributions from freelancers are important to us. I guess one thing I'll add, Ed, is that we edit really vigorously. And we are not the kind of operation where a reporter, sends in a story and then, it runs, virtually unchanged. We come back with a lot of questions and a lot of comments and a lot of suggestions, often go through 3 or 4 rounds of editing. And so writers have to accept that. And we've had a few writers who that just was not the way they wanted to work, and we just parted ways. The vast majority of the writers we work with are good with that, understand it, appreciate it, recognize that their story is getting better. But it's not always an easy process.
Well, Don Vaughn, I'm going to hand it back to you and entertain any questions that might come from these
Sure.
other folks.
We do have a couple of questions here. Hannah was wondering what kind of essays you're looking for, what kind of themes or subjects?
So, I noticed on our website that essays are listed there, and we have run a few, but not many. And I think we're really trying to sort that out. We are not an opinion operation, and so some people have approached us, which are basically, newspaper op-eds or columns, and that's not what we do. And neither are we really looking for highly opinionated essays. The essays that we've run have usually been when a person has a first person experience or expertise on a subject matter. So, for example, we ran a piece from a Duke professor who himself was a former college athlete about how he thinks that big time college sports are just in a lot of ways today incompatible with the academic mission of the university. And he'd had a lot of athletes in his classes, and he was able to write about their experience. And with their permission, he even ran some excerpts from some of the essays that they'd written him about the time pressures that they feel. So, but we've only run a handful of pieces like that. And I think we still haven't quite figured out, what the role of the essay, what we want it to be at the assembly. I think we have a really clear vision for what we want to do with a lot of our long form, deeply reported stuff. But I think we're still kind of determining the vision for some shorter pieces, including essays. So I probably haven't done a great job answering that question. And that's because we haven't really run a whole lot of essays. But the ones we've run, as I said, have really been kind of centered in first person experience or expertise.
You mentioned short pieces. I think the website mentions short pieces in some other areas. Do you have some non-opinion short pieces? No.
We've, we on Fridays, we often run something that's a little offbeat or lighter. The cheese biscuit piece was not a long piece. That was, I don't know, I'm just going to guess, say it was 1,200 to 1,500 words, something like that. Um, um, and then occasionally we'll do kind of an update on something. We ran on primary night, almost all the reporters at the assembly wrote something short in the 250 to 500 word length. So I was just talking today with one of my colleagues at the assembly, talking about, trying to figure out what this vision is for the shorter stories that we want to publish.
Yeah. Okay.
And Mark was said, as you mentioned, John, many of the new online news outlets are nonprofits. Without deep pockets, how will they continue to hold politicians and corporations accountable?
That's a good question. There's no perfect model for funding journalism, and every one of them has its pros and cons. Now, for years, local and regional newspapers lived off of advertising and, display advertising from, retailers and automobile dealers and home sellers. Well, the downside to that is that a major advertiser can get unhappy with your coverage and let you know and threaten to pull their advertising if your coverage doesn't change. So, that was the downside to that model. The downside to the nonprofit models is you still have funders that you have to go to every year. And a lot of foundations, they have an interest. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a certain kind of policy area that they're interested in, and they want to fund something related to that policy area. So you're still in a situation where your funder can attempt to exert pressure on the news outlet to do a certain kind of coverage. So the nonprofit, at first glance, I think a lot of people think, oh, the nonprofit model is the way to go, and maybe it is, but I would say that there are downsides to the nonprofit model. But if I were doing a nonprofit model, I would still want to have some other consistent source of revenue, whether that's reader contributions the way NPR has it, or whether it's paid digital subscriptions or something. I'd want to have some kind of revenue stream from the people who actually consume the journalism.
Yeah.
Mike Welton, you've written for the Assembly. Could you tell us a little bit about the stories that you've written for them and the experience of writing for the Assembly?
I write about architecture mostly, and mostly for shelter publications, although for the Washington Post also. It's been a really good experience, mostly because of John Drescher, because he is, to my mind, maybe the finest editor in the state. And he's ruthless too. He doesn't, I'm used to having people take my work and not really touch it. And we really have gone through 3 and 4 very tough revisions, and then it's handed off to Kate, who also has a voice in it. The pieces that I've written have been fairly interesting, and it's been collaborative. I suggested a story on Raleigh's skyline to John maybe 2 years ago, and he said, "Well, why don't you think about comparing the development of Raleigh's skyline to Charlotte's skyline?" And so that's what I did, and I was able to touch base with, you know, the people who made Raleigh's skyline what it is, and also the people who made the Charlotte skyline what it was, and it's a dynamic story. And Hugh McCall, I had a long conversation with, and also with the former mayor of Charlotte, and they worked hand in glove to make it what it was, and to turn Charlotte from a small town into the second largest financial center in the nation. And then I spoke with the planner who was in charge of Raleigh's, who took a completely different point of view, not to focus just on downtown, but to focus on 8 clusters around the downtown area. There are 2 different approaches, and I think it did very well. So there was that, and then John suggested to me maybe a couple months later a piece on the trend in commercial real estate development of offices being turned into rental properties, residential. And so I worked on that for Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Raleigh, and what the trend was, and that was right at the very front end of that trend, and that is playing out right now in a really difficult way for most commercial real estate developers. Their properties are being sold off and at pretty discounted rates. And then there've been 2 or 3 others since then, but each of them has been edited extremely well, and I've learned something every time I've worked with John Drescher. That's all I can say.
A great recommendation.
Well,
John, Terry was, I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
yeah. Well, thanks for that, Mike. And the story that compared Raleigh and Charlotte skylines and how their downtown had grown and the different approaches has been one of our most read stories. Last time I checked, it was at least 50,000 page views, which I think would make it. I'm pretty sure would make it one of our. It would be one of our top 10 stories in terms of readership. And it was a really interesting story, and it also had the benefit when a lot of people search, I think a lot of people search on Google from other states, and I search for Raleigh and Charlotte, and they're looking for a great place to move to. So that story continues. That's probably been 2 years since we published that, Mike.
It was the first one, and I want to say it was 2022, maybe late 2022.
Yeah, so it continues to still drive traffic for us. So that was a good one.
So
John,
what I want to emphasize, Don, is that it was collaborative. I made a suggestion, and John made it better, and then I was able to, really plug into these power brokers in both cities, and then put it together. And he and Kate were extremely helpful in making it what it was.
how
So
long did that whole project take you, Mike, from idea to publish?
Well, I've been concerned about the Raleigh skyline for a long time, but um, that story I think was 6 weeks to 2 months.
so
Um,
um, that'll be a good jumping off point for me to talk about. When you're trying to build a statewide readership, how do you do stories that consistently do that appeal to a statewide reader? And this is a challenge I often face, particularly with people who've been local news reporters, because they tend to want to go very much into the weeds on a local news issue. And what I often have to say to them, if you're going to write about this local news issue in Wilmington, is how are we going to do this story in a way that someone in Asheville or Charlotte, someone on the other side of the state is interested in this? And so to do that, you have to try to find some universal themes. You have to remember that your audience is not just in the community. If you're doing a story on something going on in Wilmington, and the story only appeals to people who live in Wilmington, then it's not going to be a successful assembly story. You have to broaden it out for a statewide audience. And I think the reason that I suggested to Mike that we compare the Raleigh to Charlotte was because Raleigh and Charlotte are always comparing themselves to each other. And it was, obviously the two largest metro areas in the state. And it was a way to kind of broaden the interest in the story, not to mention the fact that there's a really, as Mike showed, there's a really different way and that a different strategy to their downtowns. So, but what I was trying to get at there is trying to do, we really want stories that they can be set in a place which is good, but they need to have statewide appeal.
John, Terry was wondering if you've established an AI policy yet, and she was curious about your thoughts on the use of AI in journalism, specifically research, reporting, and writing.
So we don't have an AI policy yet, but we are at least talking about it. What our approach should be. And so my thoughts aren't very developed. I mean, I think as a research tool, I'm fine. But AI is wrong, just flat out wrong a lot of the time. So, it's not something that you can really rely on. Um, I heard someone say this a while ago, saying like, Wikipedia is a great place to go to start. But remember that there's plenty of stuff that you read in there that might not be right. So I mean, I think that AI is no, we don't have a policy. I'm open towards using it in creative ways. But in the end, the journalism that we do has to be original and it has to be verifiable. And I'm not sure that AI scores very well in either of those areas.
Do you use fact checkers?
Yeah, we did. So one of the things when Kyle created the assembly, he really and I give him a lot of credit for this. He wanted to do everything in a top flight way. And as far as I know, we're paying better than anybody in North Carolina right now. But among the things that he did was we have a team of copy editors who are contract copy editors. Well, that's a great thing in journalism in 2024 to have a professional qualified copy editor. I mean, in essence, the McClatchy, well, McClatchy Papers would probably push back on this, but there's very little copy editing that goes on at a lot of traditional newspapers anymore. And when I went to the Post, it was so great to again have professional copy editors who were giving a story a really close read. And we have that at the Assembly. We have copy editors who give a story a real close read and do fact checking. And that's, when I talked about the arduous process, when Mike talked about it, getting 3 rounds of editing from me and then having the managing editor, Kate Shepard, read behind me, Kate or Kyle, and now our new assistant editor. And then after that, you have another round of editing from a copy editor. So it's a lot of hurdles to clear, but it's part of the reasons that the stories are of a high quality.
I am
But
personally, I am so happy to hear that you have that many layers of editorship going on there. All of us, I'm sure, have seen articles online and even more depressingly in print where it was very obvious there was no copy editing going on. You
Yeah.
sometimes wonder if there was even an editor involved in any way. So I'm sure I speak for others when I say thank you for going that extra length, even though it's more work for the writer. The end product obviously will be much, much better for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone else have any questions for John? Well, we have him. This is a remarkable opportunity, and this is a terrific platform that we should definitely consider if you've got some ideas. So anybody else have anything?
I have a question.
Vera?
Hey, John, this is Vera Wilson. I live in Wilmington. I'm just curious, what was the last pitch that a freelancer made to you that you guys accepted?
I should just look at some of the, recent stories. Let me call them up real quick. I mean, so I had a story published Monday about legalized gambling on sports in North Carolina. And my part of it was related, the history part, it related to Bill Friday when he was at UNC and how he cracked down on it after a point shaving scandal in the early 1960s. But my co-writer, really the lead writer on that, was Steve Riley, my former colleague at the News and Observer, who went on to be the editor of the Houston Chronicle. And so, I mean, Steve is not on the staff. Now, that wasn't a pitch from him. That was a pitch from me to Steve saying, why don't we do this together? But we run stuff all the time, almost every week that came from a freelancer pitch. I'm just looking, got my iPad out here. I'm just looking at some of our recent stories. I work often, I tend to do our stories that are about politics and government. And I work often with Brian Anderson, who's a freelancer based in Raleigh. And we're working together on a story that we'll publish next week related to a congressional race. The story I mentioned, I've mentioned a couple times, a story about Eastern North Carolina cheese biscuits. That came from a reporter who had recently left WRAL, but wanted to write a fun piece for us. We ran a nice piece last week about the sports radio guys, Joe Ovies and Joe Giglio, who were kind of staples on Triangle Sports Radio, had their show canceled by Capital Broadcasting, and then have started a podcast now. So that was a pitch that came from a freelancer. Also, last week, we posted a really good story that I was the editor on about why breast cancer screening fails many women.
Yeah, I saw that.
And that was written by a freelancer. So it's, I think, well, yeah, most of our stories, I think are still more than 50% of our stories are coming from freelancers.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Does anyone else have any questions for John?
Yeah,
Joel?
yeah, I posted in the chat. I noticed the McClatchy people are using a lot of subsidized journalism, I guess you'd call it. It sort of puts you at an unfair disadvantage where it says, well, this story was underwritten by X, Y. you know, it seems rather, well, it seems outrageous to me, having worked for the News Observer, remembering the guys that worked there, all of a sudden to have massive staffing cuts and then go out begging for people to underwrite their journalism and then raise my subscription rates.
So this is an interesting question in the industry about, and I, when I was at the NNO, I did, we did have some reporters who were underwritten by funders, by, a nonprofit
Mhm.
funder. And my starting point is that when you do that, you first of all need to be transparent about that. You need to disclose it. And then I think you don't want to take money from a group. If you're an independent news organization, you don't want to take money from a group that has a real point of view. You certainly don't want to take money from a group that's seen as partisan. And I think it's okay, like if you took money from a group that was just committed to having, let's just say, more coverage of the criminal justice system, I think that would be fine. I think it wouldn't be fine to take money from a group that was committed to eliminating most bail, for example, very narrowly targeted on a certain specific
Mhm.
issue. But it's a quandary. I mean, if um, when I was at the NNO and having to, just cut huge amounts of staff, you're desperate to try, you see the coverage gaps that you have, and you're trying to think creatively about how you can fill them. So I understand the motivation to doing that, but I also think that there can be some real problems associated with it.
I'd like to point out, since I write a blog on a good deal that covers history of journalism, that sponsored journalism was actually the norm until the 1880s, and the rise of national corporations who, to expand their circulation, needed to project at least the simulacrum of objectivity. People, it used to be that people were as siloed then as they are now. You subscribe to a Whig newspaper, or you subscribe
Right.
to a Democratic newspaper, et cetera, and you didn't expect objectivity. Being an editor could get you in a duel or get you killed. I'm sure you're happy to be past that period in history. But yeah, it's either you're going to please the advertisers or you're going to please the backers. And it's probably delicate unicycle ride to do both. I would also add that anybody who objects to having their prose messed with just has not dealt with Bob Brooks enough.
Yeah. Well, I worked for Bob as a young reporter in the 80s, and Bob was I don't think there's anybody better than I come across than Bob at basically spotting a hole in a story or a weakness.
Oh yeah.
He was an old school guy, but some of that old school was good.
Yeah.
There was some real Bob had some real editing skills. Unfortunately, in some ways, the journalism has come full cycle back to the 1800s, where you basically have, particularly on the network cable shows,
Mhm.
shows that are clearly affiliated with one side or the other, which I think is kind of unfortunate. And I don't really get what the appeal is to just watch a network where their whole mission is to serve you news that you just instinctively agree with. It doesn't seem to me to be very fun to watch.
That's not real news.
Yeah, it would seem kind of boring to me, but apparently a lot of Americans just want news that kind of confirms their view of the world.
Does anyone else have any questions? No one? John, thank you. I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. This was
Yeah.
fascinating. The Assembly sounds like a remarkable publication. I really appreciate you joining us tonight to talk about
I'll
it.
be
I think you're
subscribing.
probably going to get some queries from this group soon.
Great. Well, my pleasure to talk with you. Good questions. And I hope I'll be disappointed if we don't get some pitches from this group.
No, I know you will. I know you will. I'm
Yeah.
pondering one myself, actually. So,
Of course you are.